Shift left has to be embodied in your development practices, your risk management practices, but it really starts as a design principle for the whole organization. It's an element of culture.
So I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective where when we're talking about shifting things left, it's not just about a digital product or a piece of software. It's about how you think about all the different pieces that go around that, like risk. Are you asking the questions early enough? Do you have the right people in the conversation at day one?
Welcome to This is Digital, a podcast brought to you by West Monroe. Join us as we talk to leading experts about bringing the digital mindset to your organization.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Digital, a podcast that goes behind the scenes to reveal how digital shows up in the operations of companies every day. My name is Erik Brown, and I want to thank Rissa for letting me guest host a couple episodes of the podcast. I've been at West Monroe since its founding back in 2002, and I currently lead engineering within our Pixel practice. Pixel stands for Product Experience and Engineering Lab. I actually think we should create a sub-brand for my couple of episodes. I'm often called by my nickname Brownie, and it seems like Brownie Bites would be a solid name. For these episodes, we're going to be dropping some digital bites of knowledge at a fairly rapid clip, and yeah, the pun was intended. So, digital. It's a word as a software engineer by background that drives me a bit nuts, to be honest. Software is inherently digital, and it can mean so many other things, but in general, it's how companies use technology, teams, process to efficiently adjust to customer demands and create value. Within that, today, the topic is going to be the phrase shift left, another phrase that drives me a little bit batty. It is certainly not a political movement, but it refers to, in the digital landscape, how companies can lower time to market in all of their digital activities. Just my perspective on it. We're going to dig in more detail. Frankly, it's nice to have a change of pace and be talking about something other than generative AI and chat GPT these days. So I am looking forward to this discussion. There are three big takeaways we're hoping you leave with after today's conversation. One, this idea of shift left is for all industries. Two, it's about ruthless prioritization for the customer. Three, it unifies teams across organizations within a business to ship software, which is the foundation of most digital businesses today. You can read a little bit more perspective on this at westmonroe.com/shiftleft. With that said, let's dive in, and I'd like to welcome my illustrious colleagues and also Rick Sabatino. Frankly, Rick, in your case, we're just happy you're here, to be honest. This is take two of this episode of the podcast. Rick logged in from a Pentium running Windows ME, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Did not work out. Today, Rick, you doing all right? Your recording still going?
I'm still hanging in there.
Okay, we can hear him. I see video. Things are off to a much better start. Rick is from our operations excellence practice. Glad to have you here. He'll be doing a bit more of an introduction. We also have Sean McHale from our M&A practice and Dana Tomey from our financial services practice. They're going to do a quick intro and go a bit deeper into what they do for our clients here. Sean, let's start with you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Brownie. My name is Sean McHale. I come from the mergers and acquisitions practice, but specialize entirely in technology. I have a background of about 25 years in the tech industry, many of those years as a coder, and then many more as a CTO. Since then, I moved over to M&A, where I advise our private equity clients on their investments, both around the risks and the opportunities, specifically around custom architectures. We see a lot of different things based upon the industry and the practices within those organizations. And the idea of it shifting left is something that's really becoming more prevalent now as organizations become more digital.
Dana, can you give a quick intro?
Sure. Thanks, Erik. Yep. My name is Dana Tomey. As Erik mentioned, I come out of West Monroe's financial services practice, and I actually run our risk and compliance sub-practice within banking. So I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective where when we're talking about shifting things left, it's not just about a digital product or a piece of software. It's about how you think about all the different pieces that go around that, like risk. Are you asking the questions early enough? Do you have the right people in the conversation at day one? How do you help prioritize how your institutions, banking or otherwise, think about the risk that can be introduced with digital products. So Erik, excited to be here, excited to bring that perspective.
Happy to have you here. And last, but all joking aside, not least, Rick, can you do a quick intro as well?
Rick Sabatino. I'm in our operations excellence practice. I actually come from a technology background originally, and there were two reasons that I moved over to the organizational design development side of things. Was, we're getting requirements to build things that basically made sure everything ran the way it did today, and we weren't getting that forward movement. And if we did, we were then having trouble getting the behavior change that get people to get the value out of those. So I've been working in organizational design development and change for the better part of the last 20 years across a variety of industries. But really, how do we shift the behavior along the way to get the value out of our solutions?
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. I love the different perspective. So with Sean, seeing a lot of businesses in a lot of different industries, often through that transactional lens, going through M&A and diligence. Dana, a focus on risk and how we look at risk through the shift left within building applications within an industry. And then Rick, more coming from the technical background, but looking at the change that organizations are going through as they look at figuring out this shift to the left. I'd love to hear more about those three perspectives. And Sean, maybe we'll start with you. What does shift left really mean as you look at all these organizations from so many different backgrounds, so many different industries, et cetera?
I think it's twofold. I think part of it is around the software development practices. It focuses more on collaborative decision making. Customer satisfaction is huge. I think you alluded to that the intro, and development in much shorter sprints. Traditionally we see a lot of companies who focus more on like a waterfall method or development, long iterations of development, and then testing and quality control, then launch, and then bug fixes, debugging, updates, all that. The more digital companies, the ones who have shifted left or who are born more in the digital space, they combine that development, testing, and quality control all into that beginning stage. And that helps so many things. And I see so many companies which, have not adequately looked at things like automated testing or security enhancements from the start. And those are the types of things which will slow them down significantly as they move forward post-launch.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you mentioned, Sean, it's to me going back to a movement that I've been involved with for a long time in software. It's agile lean, right? So many of those concepts are evident in this shift left, right? Okay, let's compress the time to delivery. It's not like a anything goes mentality, but let's try to create value as quickly as we can and test that value. But then I guess the question is, then how is it different, right? And Dana, maybe you could give perspective on that as we look in the enterprise setting, right? And this idea of focusing on risk in the shift left. How do you define that and maybe differentiate it from some of those other more agile lean concepts?
Absolutely. So I am going to latch on to a word that Sean said, right? Collaboration. In my world, collaboration, when you're talking about risk, is absolutely key. The institutions that we work with in banking, as well as all the other verticals that we have so much brain power in so many different areas. And a lot of times the miss is not getting that collective brain power at the table early. And what we see happening is if risk isn't considered early, if compliance isn't considered early to make sure that you've got the right standards or regulations or frameworks in place, it creates rework on the back end. So you can compress the time frame, you can, do all the great testing and evidencing and all of those things. And if the risk questions weren't asked up front, it's going to eat into your ROI because you're then going to have to go back, readdress potential concerns, and kind of go through that loop again. And so for us, as we introduce this kind of idea of shift left, especially with kind of my singular focus on risk sometimes, it's really about the collaboration, having the right people at the table, and introducing those frameworks as early as we possibly can.
Yeah, I have so many more questions about that. We're going to dig into that in more detail because I know you've been working at a large bank on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So some specific tangible examples would be super interesting there. The other conclusion we draw from all of that and hearing just those two perspectives on this term is you have to change the organizational structure to make this real. Rick, I know you're focused kind of on that lens in OpEx. Can you talk about the definition from your perspective?
Yeah, happy to. The shift left has to be embodied in your development practices, your risk management practices, but it really starts as a design principle for the whole organization. It's an element of culture. And how do I think about things differently? So working with an organization right now, they are looking to shift left. And so we're working with them to rethink the way their technology organization operates. And they're very much off to the right. Most of their workforce today is fixing user issues, resetting passwords, routine operational stuff. So they have no capacity to do the strategic work that the business partners in their organization are asking for. And they're still running 50% more operating cost on technology than they should be by benchmarks. And so how do they design, how do they change the mindsets of their people to be thinking about that strategic point of view and not worrying so much about password resets? And that requires infrastructure changes. It requires organizational design changes. It may, and in this case it does, right, requires shifting some of the work to a managed services provider who excels at that work instead of trying to build all of the operational talent in-house, and then redesigning the internal IT organization to be strategically focused and changing all of the roles in there. And so it's a complex piece of laying the groundwork, but we're structuring into the organization, hey, you think about strategic work. You think early in the process. You're not a break-fix organization anymore. And that mindset is probably the hardest thing to shift. It's easy to move lines and boxes around on an org chart. But when we get to how do you get ahead of demand? How do you start being a partner with the business and solutioning so that you're solving their problems with what's available in the stack already? Those are real important questions that change the way people interact with others in the business and with one another.
It sounds funny saying this on a podcast. If we try to visualize this, this old waterfall approach, and we thought about Agile Lean primarily as a movement to overcome some of the pitfalls of waterfall to create software, right? We go through these laborious requirements phases, then design, and then we start building and realize, well, the requirements have changed and the design maybe isn't appropriate. To some extent, Agile shifted that left. But I think the idea of this new movement, right, this new term is referring to, Rick, everything you were talking about in bringing these multidisciplinary teams together. And Dana, more than that, it's the processes that go along with that, right? How do we execute risk and compliance processes more efficiently and shift that left as well? So we have this kind of old visual waterfall view compressing not just with software, but with the other organizations involved with the execution of that software, the monitoring of that software, the compliance associated with it, right? Is that a fair? I see some heads nodding visually. Yeah. So I think I want to get more into that from an enterprise perspective, and Dana has some great examples of it.
Yeah.
Before we do, Sean, how do you? So you see all sorts of businesses of all different sizes. Some of them are more maybe digitally native, so to speak, where they've kind of grown up with this idea of shift left embedded in them. When you're looking at these companies, how do you see the differences between maybe these more native companies and how they look at this movement, if they're even looking at it? Is it native to them? Versus some of the more traditional organizations that are trying to move towards that?
Comparing a Silicon Valley unicorn versus kind of an older financial services company, which has evolved since the 1970s, still working with even mainframe technologies, completely different approaches to how they do things in software development. What I see with the Silicon Valley unicorns is that they will, have incorporated unit testing to every bit of their code, automated testing across the board, 100% coverage. They will have security testing implemented early on in that process so that, third-party components which may contain vulnerabilities, which could, potentially cause a breach, are detected before that code ends up in the production environment. Versus what I see with some of the more traditional non-digital companies, we will see code that has very, very limited test coverage, which increases the likelihood of flaws entering that production environment. And worse is that there's nothing in their processes or their controls to detect vulnerabilities in the source code, which really increases the likelihood of a cyber attack. So, those stark differences really make a huge difference. And those are probably just the smallest mechanisms of, or the earliest stages of going digital or shifting left, I would say.
Are companies, especially kind of the middle market, upper middle market companies you're looking at, are they starting to execute security into the life cycle, like a lot of businesses have been doing with testing and traditional QA for a long time? So we're building dynamic and static security tests into deployments to development and into just standard deployment workflows and build workflows. Are you seeing more of that?
It's becoming more prevalent, but I would say that it's a minority of companies at this point. We do see folks who are incorporating in penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, just because there are regulations industry-wide, depending upon which industry they're in. But the SAST and DAST, the static testing and the dynamic testing, it's not happening often. It's pretty rare to see that. I'd say probably less than 1% of the companies we look at will actually have that implemented.
Across industries?
Right.
More in general. Okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
Whereas, the digital ones, they would absolutely have that as part of their release cadence. It's part of their pipeline every single time.
Sean, I think it may be worth differentiating even the companies that kind of grew up digital. The mature ones are doing it, but there are very prominent names in the digital space that still haven't grown up, right? Like they're adolescents at best. And that's one of the things that I see in Dana. I know you've seen this. Leaders looking to mimic what they see in Silicon Valley, and they say, "Well, Netflix is pretty mature, but they still pretty much they leave all the break fix to the right. Like get release fast, find it in production, and fix it quickly." Is their model, and that doesn't work for a lot of industries. And so I think that scares some of our clients. When they look at they can't take that regulatory posture and that's not what we're talking about, right? Like they've prioritized that for their business model, but there's a lot of variation you need to consider. Is that fair?
Well, Dana, I think I want to hear Dana's perspective in more detail on this, but I want to touch on something you just said, right? The classic examples, right, in Silicon Valley of this truly natural shift left that they've taken from basically the onset of their business, their digital business, right, is Netflix, right? How many times do Facebook, Netflix, they just deploy tens of thousands of times a day across, hundreds of applications and systems, right? Well, okay, if you don't get your most recent sent to you in a notification, or you can't stream for 2 seconds the latest episode of, I'm going to date myself, what's on Netflix now? Whatever current show is on Netflix. All right. The fallout of that is limited. But you go to we work in a lot of these highly regulated industries, in healthcare, in energy and utilities, and financial services, of course. If you're going to have a significant outage or a miscalculation coming out of a deployment or a potential compliance or security risk, all right, that's not going to fly. But we also can't have these typical, what's the old school waterfall approach in a lot of these highly regulated businesses? And sometimes remember the quarterly or semi-annual release, okay, get all the features in because we're only releasing 4 times a year. That doesn't work either. So Dana, I'm curious what you're seeing more in the highly regulated industry that is financial services.
So it's funny, my head went exactly where Rick went, because he and I got asked by a very large bank, help us. We want to get faster, better. We want to compete with the fintechs, but we've got all these regulations that we have to meet. Tell us how the Silicon Valley groups do it. Tell us how other banks do it. Tell us how other highly regulated industries like healthcare, like energy and utilities, how are they doing it, right? So we went out and did a bunch of research and said, what is that model? What is that matrix? Is it highly regulated, low regulated, super fast, super slow? And where should that bank want to be based on its goals? And there is always, to your point, there's always going to be a trade-off. You cannot release products at a bank daily. Can't do it. Regulators won't like it. You won't nail down all your risks. You'll be out of compliance somewhere. And to your point, an outage at a bank is a significantly different thing than an outage at Netflix. I know I would personally hit the panic button if I could not access my app, right? I want to know that my money's where it is. We just kind of saw a catastrophe with that. And so for us, it was, what is that sweet spot? And what is that sweet spot for different banks because one large bank is not the same as the next. And so what is their model and what is their culture? And ultimately, we landed far more left than where this particular bank started, but not as far left as the Netflixes, the Twitters, some of these other tech companies that leverage break fix, that leverage canaries, that leverage super users that they roll out new code to, that break it really quickly and they deploy fixes. So it is very different model. What I would say, though, is what is allowing them to get faster is that culture and perspective of proactive risk. It's not about breaking something and fixing it later anymore. It's about getting ahead of the curve and saying, what are the risks? Can we proactively break it for ourselves up front before a release or before we even get into any sort of true detailed design? Let's do it up front. And so really shifting into that proactive stance has helped get things faster, create a really awesome competitive nature for this particular client that has outright said, we are going to compete with the fintechs. That is where we're going. That is who we want to be. We want to go out into the market and just kick butt. And so helping them get there has meant not only taking into account what Sean talks about in terms of some of like the technical detail and that testing, Rick helping to come in, because Rick worked on this project too, helping to come in and design a model where we've got dotted lines of interaction all over the place. It's our new favorite thing. It's no longer solid lines, it's dotted lines. And then making sure we're asking the risk questions and having the right people up front. So, for us, it's about finding that balance and making sure the trade-off is appropriate for speed to risk.
So we're getting rid of that traditional mentality of at these milestones throwing it over the wall, so to speak, right? That's 100%. How it used to happen, right? Okay, yep. We got this new version of software. It's ready to go. It's gotten through basic QA. Now, hand it over the wall and let's see what compliance says. So We're bringing that forward.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. There's no wall. There should be no wall, right? Like they should be at the table up front, having a voice, having a say, so that when you get into testing, you're testing for key compliance and risk issues as well.
So what are some examples of that? Like how in this particular project, and we've been doing this, what is it, better part of a year now? Over a year?
Yeah, been a while.
So what are some of the most noticeable shifts that they've made from a risk and compliance perspective in the software process, and how has that shown value to the business?
Great question. So the organizational change has honestly been key. So Rick came in with a couple team members early on and said, we understand your pain, right? Like one group can't see the risk coming from another group and somebody else is getting tagged with findings because it's flowing from somewhere else. Like, how do we get away from all of these silos and start to break that down? And that's where kind of my dotted line thing comes in, right? It's, yes, technically everybody has the group they report into. You're a product person. Yes, you own that product, but shifting the mindset into instead of the product person just sitting there and saying, okay, what do I have to build for? What's my deadline? It's like, where am I breaking glass, or what risk is this introducing downstream that may not affect me, but is going to affect the end user? And so we have been able to go in and not only design, but essentially pilot and play the role of this floating. There are a lot of different terms for it, right? Like we started with the term ninja, like we're going to call them ninjas, or we're going to call them, Rick, help me out. What did we ultimately land on? Principals and agents? Is that right?
Principals and agents.
So we're going to play these two different roles where one is highly seeped in risk and compliance and putting that eye on everything. And the other one is more seeped in the product, and they're talking together and they're working together in every aspect. So we are playing that role. We are essentially gluing the security team together with the product teams, together with the risk governance team, together, with the line of business that's ultimately going to want to put some sort of use case in place. And we're making sure that all those pieces are coming together and having kind of that like star. I can mentally see our icon for it, right? It's like that star with all the offshoots, so that everything kind of has a singular point of truth in the middle where everybody's coming together, has allowed this particular institution to go live with a product faster than ever before. And so it's been a really awesome thing to watch happen. And it's going to be super cool to help them now scale that product and add additional products to it.
So in the Agile process, you're seeing the business owners of features that are getting built into the software coming forward and being part of the life cycle with engineers, with architects, right? And that same thing. So do you have members of compliance of risks then that are joining those same meetings, that are doing grooming, that are doing the functional elaboration and that sort of thing along incrementally with the engineering teams?
You said it far better than I did, but yes, that's absolutely what's happening. In some instances, we're playing that role to help facilitate, because it's hard to just kind of flip that switch overnight with existing talent or to go out and find that talent. But yes, that's the model that we've set up that we're executing against.
So Sean, even in those industries that aren't as heavily regulated, are you seeing other organizational changes happening beyond just the traditional kind of driving a more incremental feedback loop between functional owners of the business and engineering? Are you seeing other changes as you're looking at all these organizations?
Honestly, not a whole lot. I mean, these are things that we take into account in terms of our recommendations, but more often than not, these are considered gaps, and we are recommending that folks are added in more earlier on. Especially software development side. Incorporating in your cybersecurity team into the development cycle earlier on, understanding that incorporating in security resources when handling sensitive data, for example, on the application security side. I'd say for the most part, no, we're not seeing it enough, unfortunately. As I said before, with some of the more mature organizations, they're doing exactly what Dana described there. It's completely night and day between the two types of organizations.
I think there's so much gray area between general agile lean concepts that businesses have been trying to implement successfully, and frankly, over the last 5 to 10 years, getting a lot more efficient at doing so. To me, shift left was this. It's a broader term that encapsulates those agile and lean concepts, but applies it to more enterprise, large-scale organizations that are struggling more to figure out how to apply these agile and lean concepts in spite of their attempts to do so. And the reason it's more applicable is because of a lot of these regulatory requirements, more focus on risk management, some of the processes that exist in these larger industries and institutions. I don't know if you guys agree with that or you see the term differently.
I see what you're saying, and we see that, but we also see that it's not the regulations. Sometimes it's the decisions made internally on how they're going to comply with the regulations that get in the way. And those controls start to add up, and it becomes, you fail the audit not because you violated the regulation, but you violated what you said you're going to do about the regulation, or you didn't follow through on that. And so part of what we've been doing, the team Dana and I are working with, is taking some of that and simplifying the controls, but also backing off from the prescription. So a lot of enterprises have really detailed prescriptions for how to comply with a control. Those prescriptions don't necessarily keep up with the pace of technology change or the use cases. And so backing that out into guardrails. And by doing that, now your development teams actually have to think about how to comply. They don't get to just mail it in and say, yeah, we met the control procedure, we're moving on to the next, to the next story. But they have to think about how they're going to solution to those guidelines and guardrails. And that actually pulls it even further left, because you're not waiting. You could be collaborative in pulling in InfoSec, but in a large enterprise, that's hard to do. And so pulling some of that responsibility into the development teams themselves, so that they're complying with the design, with the control objectives, and not the letter of these prescriptions that have been documented. And that gives the organization more leeway to be compliant and pass audit. It's
a great call out. Yeah. And to your point, right, it's about meeting the spirit of the rule. And in some instances, you'll be hard pressed to find a lot of risk people to say this, but you can actually have less controls. Imagine fewer controls, fewer boxes to check, and more secure and more compliant. It sounds irrational, but the reality is the people in these institutions are incredibly smart. If you give them things that are too boxed in, they will find a way to break that box and work outside of it, which is the last thing you want. But give them a set of guardrails and tell them where they need to go, they'll get there.
Yeah, it reminds me of this old story that I heard in a grad school class, that there was this rule in the military, in the U.S. military, that two individuals needed to be present to man an artillery device. It was a rule for years and years, and eventually someone questioned that rule, said, "Why are we? One person can do this. Why do we have two people here?" And it turns out it went back to this old school rule where when cannons were drawn by horses, one person needed to man the horse and then one person needed to fire the cannon. So it's like, well, the control didn't really catch up with the environment. So are we in that kind of scenario? Is it that the controls, because I heard two sides of this potentially, is it that the controls and the regulators need to catch up with the power of the tooling that we have available today? Or is it that the traditional organizations need to just realize that we can meet the needs of the regulation by shifting left and just being more effective with how we meet the control?
Best consulting answer, both, right? Like, okay. It's never easy, but I definitely think there's both, right? So as you look at institutions, like Sean was saying, some of these banks are 100 years old, 50 years old, their technology is incredibly stale, frankly, at this point. The controls they have in place have not kept up with technology, but they are managing the technology that they do have, which is what is necessary. When you read through regulations and security frameworks, there's very little that is finitely prescriptive. It's mostly gray area that allows these, at least in banking, the institutions to operate as they need to manage their risk. And the banks will know their risk best. So it kind of goes both ways, to be honest. But then the people at the bank or at whatever institution you're working with also need to fully understand their risk and their risk model so they can communicate it back to the regulators and say, hey, this is our technology, this is the risk that surrounds it, and this is how we know that we're managing and mitigating that risk.
I want to ask a couple other questions to close this out. The first is, I think, a good segue to what we were just talking about the last few minutes, especially in some of the larger institutions that have to deal with traditional process and these compliance challenges. Where do you start? Where it seems like, and Dana, you were alluding to this, it's more about talking to the individuals about how they're working and figuring out where we can bring left some of this process. But what have you all learned in some of the work that you've done recently? I mean, Dana, we've been talking a lot about the bank and we'll get there, but Sean, any ideas on where you've seen companies start as they're trying to shift left?
Yeah, it's completely different depending upon the size of the organization, the age of the organization, and some of the processes and controls which are already ingrained in their teams. Every so often we'll see a smaller organization, say fewer than 50 engineers, and they are stuck in just the confines of whatever process has existed, but they are all keen to change and they're able to execute that change quickly. Some of the larger organizations, when you've got hundreds of teams, that's far more difficult. And driving that change it has to be done incrementally. And I think that introduction of maybe smaller steps, greater unit test coverage, perhaps, as one thing, the software composition analysis as another, just adding those in. That can be difficult if you're dealing with a large monolithic code base as well. There are a lot of things which are going to impact your ability to shift left quickly. And as a whole, leadership has to be on board. We will speak to CTOs who just are stuck in their ways from when they learned things back in maybe the 90s, and it isn't necessarily the best practice now. And then to Rick's point, I really it got me thinking about early release often concept, which kind of became very, very popular. I'd say 15 years ago or so, when you'd have, I think Flickr was launching at the time, Reddit, a number of others. The idea was, we'll just fix that in production. But most businesses cannot survive that. It works for these small startups, but it's not even just regulations. It's just that can lead to mass chaos. So getting folks to focus more on the test early, test often is far better way about things. And getting people to buy into that, I think, is a bit more straightforward because folks are well aware of the risks involved, especially security. As soon as you start mentioning security risks, potential downtime, potential damage to your business, then that gets people's attention. So kind of went all over the place there, but it is possible, but there are so many factors and variables involved there.
Rick and Dana, in work at not only the bank, but other large organizations recently, what are the successful places you've found to start as businesses look to shift?
I think it's critical to be really clear on where you're going. So in the banking example, right, we knew that the client wanted to be compliant, but also competitive with fintech. And they had some very clear details on where are they headed and what does good look like. And making sure that everyone was aligned on that was the first effort, because until people agreed on the vision, we were getting all kinds of different demands from different stakeholders. And I think a general principle for shifting left is like really having a clear vision of where you're going and understanding where the gaps are from where you're at today, and then cultivating in your people the ability to self-evaluate how they're doing against that vision so that you're steering as a group and not trying to push everyone in one direction or another. And that's essentially, there's a lot of tactical work around, operating model and org design. But at the end of the day, it was about getting a lot of the people to agree on the vision for where they were going and to have some ownership in how it was operationalized.
Dana, did Rick just nail that, or any other additional commentary?
As always, yes. The thing I would add to it, though, is in highly regulated industries, healthcare, EU, FS, right? Findings are, you got to fix the current state problems and crawl back to the root cause. It's what you got to lay out the vision because you got to know where you're going. But then you got to kind of go back to the beginning, go way, way right and say, all right, what's broken? What's not working? What's getting you in trouble? And then crawl left from there, because you can't just hop from, I'm in a bunch of trouble, but here's my vision, so we're good. Once you can do that, it's really getting into that root cause that you can then adjust, pivot from to get to the vision that you're building toward. So in some ways, the regulations help because it's bright red little flag saying, here's a problem, come fix me. That really kind of signals this is where you start.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, one of the core takeaways we haven't spent as much time on is ruthless prioritization, but it's absolutely embedded in, Rick, what you brought up, and Dana, what you were clarifying as well. We often think of this as, I think we probably haven't talked about it as much as because we think about that in the context of the Agile Lean movement and Silicon Valley, like this, let's just release, test, get data, get customers interacting with the platform and learn from that and ruthlessly prioritize based on what we learn. Well, that's part of what you're doing, right? If these banks want to be competitive with fintechs and healthcare companies want to be competitive with some of the startups in this space, that's a big part of it. But it's also, how do you ruthlessly prioritize where you can save cycles, where you can more efficiently comply with some of these regulatory drivers and stuff like that? I mean, was that part of the discussion that you brought forward in that kind of shift to the left?
In the very, very beginning, way, way back, however long we've been there, the initial question is, where in the world are the problems coming from? I'm getting tagged with them. I can't see them coming. My world looks and feels clean. What is happening? Ultimately, that has led us down this path where we are. But it truly started with the go find the root cause. And it turned out the root cause was just widespread. It wasn't like it was a singular thing to address. It kind of brought up all these issues that's led us to this conversation. That was the ruthless prioritization in the very beginning. It was, we can't have this. We can't have these many findings. It's pulling people away from their day job. It's taking us too much money to resolve, too much time. And then ultimately led to the conversation of, what do we want to be and how do we proactively position ourselves to be better?
Super helpful. So, final question. If you can't measure it, doesn't matter. There's another saying, I'm paraphrasing, but measurement matters. So as these organizations look to institute some of these shifts, how do you measure that? Sean, what are some of the things that you're seeing across these organizations you're working with?
I think a big part of it would just be looking at your standard SDLC metrics. terms of your velocity. I mean, it is probably an obvious one. Defect rate, your scans, if you've incorporated scans, just understanding what your releases look like, where nothing's being detected, or if in fact you are putting together builds which do have vulnerabilities in them. Those are probably the main metrics I'd be looking at if we're talking about purely testing and the security portions. Leave it to the others to talk a bit about what their experiences have been.
Yeah, Sean, you remind me too. It's maybe for some of these organizations that are starting that, it's how many releases do you have, right? I mean, you're not going to be 1,000 a day, right? Like some digitally native organizations, but
that's a great point. Yeah,
if you're bringing risk, if you're bringing IT, if you're bringing compliance into the process further left, right? Then you're probably going to be able to get more releases out. And if you don't have to sign every time you bless a release, you don't have to sign a physical paper in triplicate and fax it to 3 people. That also helps too. We have audit trails for these workflows and who approved certain pull requests and that sort of thing. So, Rick, thoughts on that? How do you measure?
It depends on the function you're shifting left. If it's just an internal IT type function or the whole organization, but I think we can look to a lot of the customer experience and satisfaction metrics. IT organizations don't typically track their relationship and the with the business stakeholders and the satisfaction in it, but that's worth tracking. That's worth starting to understand better, and that can feed into your prioritization. The voice of the customer is important, and understanding where we're at on that. I think the other piece to look at is, as you're releasing faster, right? How many times you're coming back to a function and touching it again. So it's great to be agile, but it's not great to be iterating on the same function release after release after release. And that creates confusion. That may look like shifting left, but to the people who have to use the system, it looks like you're just improvising. And so shifting left is like getting better at getting it right, not just getting it done.
Dana, thoughts on the same?
I would definitely reiterate speed. I think Rick and Sean are spot on with that. In my world, they're defined KRIs that are looking to be met in terms of the risk indicators, which have also been pretty much covered by Sean and Rick. I would also, in my space, say a decrease in findings or dings from audit or regulators, right? Because that's the goal, is to get to a place. 0 is not likely, but far fewer. And then having those issues be far less impactful, and measuring how long is it taking you to remediate those issues, how much time off the side of someone's desk, or money, frankly.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. Rick, I'm super glad you were able to join. I'm glad you got that new computer and worked it out. Valuable insight from you and all of our guests here. I think, again, going back to those 3 takeaways, better late than never, but just talked a little bit about that ruthless prioritization. And the other 2, I think, were consistent topics of conversation. 1, this is for every industry and businesses of all sizes, certainly relevant. And this is about multidisciplinary teams. It's about pulling together members across organizations to compress the cycle of producing relevant software. So thank you for the conversation. Now, this is the This is Digital podcast. You heard my commentary on digital at the beginning. We got to close with your perspective. What does digital mean to you, Sean? I want to know.
Yeah, a lot of things. But that general shift from the waterfall to agile. I mean, I think that's most obvious one. The simplicity or the end user experience, how it all flows together and integrates. I think that's pretty important in being digital, where your mobile application is 100% aligned with the web experience. And part of that goes down to what building blocks you use to create those applications, flowing through to when you call up customer service for a given organization, and having that entire experience be united. I think that's a big part of it. The changes in staying on top of those, the ones that can improve your business, reduce risk, and improve the customer experience as a whole.
Dana, what does digital mean to you?
I grapple with this, frankly, especially given West Monroe and what we do. It's speed. It's access to information of all kinds. It's better user experience at every level. It's my Kindle. on my phone. And it's just the general improved usability of things that we interact with and take for granted every day.
Is it only Kindle for you? Or do you ever go to a paper book?
If in a perfect world, I have both.
So I went 100.
Sean is like, oh my God.
I went 100% Kindle, like out of principle a while ago. And then I realized sometimes at the beach or sitting by the pool, you just kind of want that. You want to turn a page, like for real, every now and then. So yeah, I'm back to hybrid model there. Rick, what does digital mean to you aside from dropping the abacus finally?
Sometimes the abacus has its place.
Listen, I don't want to get into this with you. I asked a question about digital. What does digital mean to you, Rick?
To me, what we talk about as digital today is about more than just the technology. So technology implementations, right? Those have been going on for decades and, evolving, and the technologies change. What was robo-keying in the 90s is now robotic process automation. The same concept, but the execution has evolved. When I think about digital and being a digital business, it's about taking those best practices from the way digital technologies are created and deployed and applying them to your business. So think of evolving your business along with your code base for your applications. That means if you release software, you're also releasing procedures or org structures, those sorts of pieces that go with it to stay in sync, because your procedures are the codes that the code base that the human side of the organization runs on, and it needs to be in sync across it. And a lot of times it's out of sync, and that's where we see a lot of failures as well in organizations being agile. And so how do you evolve your organization ongoing using those principles and practices that have been forged in the technology side, but across the enterprise?
Yep. Again, goes back to the beginning of the conversation. Digital is basically everything and manifests in so many different ways, but appreciate the perspectives and responses. Thanks again to our fantastic guests. This has been another episode of This is Digital, Brownie Bites edition.
Thanks for listening to This is Digital. If you enjoyed today's show, please follow or subscribe on your preferred podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a review. For more information on This is Digital, visit westmonroe.com/thisisdigital.